Thank you, Kalindi, and others at the Feminist Research Institute for organizing this, and thank you to the Patwin people on whose land we stand. I know there's now a practice among some scholars who are non-Indigenous to make this invocation, but I do so meaningfully because I want to address the question as researchers and teachers in units in settler universities who bring social justice histories to their work, to whom are we accountable? And it's part of my answer. So my answer is that we are accountable to social justice movements, but I don't want to do this as a kind of glib utterance that we repeat without grounding in the context of specific relationships to specific movements with specific goals for justice that often come at a price for scholars when we enact those relationships. So, as a scholar in Asian American studies, we're aware that we emerged out of movements that contested the US state and its imperial policies and wars at the time, including in Vietnam. So what does it mean today if our research and teaching challenges the state in the current moment in the powerful confluence of state and capitalist interests from within a public university? How can we deal with the political risk and the impact that these state policies also have on students and on communities? And so I want to give you an example today that is actually from Hart Hall, which is the building that houses the ethnic studies and interdisciplinary studies, including gender and women's studies, cultural studies, American studies, right across the street from us. And I want to actually ask you all if you've seen the exhibit of the Third World Forum that my colleague in Chicanx Studies, Professor Natalia Deep Sosa, and I curated in collaboration with students in Hart Hall. Have any of you seen it? Just so I know how much background to give you all. Okay, and some, of course, are guests to UC Davis. So let me explain. So, this year there's a lot of focus, of course, on the Third World Liberation Front and the ethnic studies strikes at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. But I think those of you who are at Davis know, my students actually don't know, that the Third World Forum was also a radical internationalist progressive student movement at Davis, lesser known than the TWLF, but that it was also anti-war, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist. And so there's an archive of the Third World Forum newsletter in the library that Professor Natalia Deep Sosa and I worked to digitize in order to launch an exhibit in Hart Hall because this history has largely been invisible, and needless to say, it's not celebrated by the institution in its discussion of diversity and institutional history. So we actually have an archive on all the floors of Hart Hall, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is when the last iteration of the Third World Forum was existent on campus, of the newsletters portraying the different struggles and different kind of voices, as well as the kind of backlash from other units on campus and other forces against the Third World Forum. Now, what was interesting was, I want to give you a little case study of this notion of accountability. A year after the exhibit was launched, we received a complaint, I'm laughing because it was from faculty in dairy sciences. One of the faculty members complained that we had the history of the Third World Forum wrong and we should correct it because they noticed a year after it was launched that a couple of the newsletters of the Third World Forum had an article that was actually critical of Zionism and Israeli state policies in the late 1960s and 70s, and another newsletter actually had a cover story titled "From Vietnam to Palestine, One Struggle, Many Fronts," and it had a picture of a Vietnamese peasant supposedly with a sickle in one hand and a keffiyeh around their face. And so these faculty reported to us that apparently not only was this material offensive, but it was incorrect, and they would replace the materials and they would give us more appropriate ones about the history of Zionism to replace it free of charge. So in response, I kid you not, so in response, Natalia and I, of course, shared this with our colleagues in ethnic studies and in Hart Hall, and the chairs and directors issued a joint statement defending the right of faculty in Hart Hall to share the history of movements, without censorship and in support of academic freedom, and also challenge this revisionist attempt to reinvent the history of a movement to suit the convenience of right-wing interests in order to provide an alibi for the legacy of settler colonialism in the region that these students at the time were resisting. Because the Third World Forum was in fact based on a notion of radical anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-Zionist politics, and that was the fact that they wanted to undo that. And so the exhibit in Hartwell is a reminder of this really inspiring history, and I'm happy to say that the exhibit is not just still standing intact, thanks to the efforts of faculty and supporters in the administration at the time, but it has been reinstalled more professionally so that it cannot be torn down or vandalized. And it's a pedagogical resource for our students and colleagues, and a reminder of ongoing battles for real freedoms, academic and otherwise. And I say this because I think that accountability to oppositional movements and histories of global justice and social justice struggles in which ethnic studies based isn't easy. It involves difficult battles, often lonely ones, given the increasing institutionalization of ethnic studies and also student activism, which means taking political risk extremely fraught. And I think this kind of institutionalization of student movements in campus, something which a lot of my students in Asian American Studies really grapple with, of course coexist with the disciplining and censorship as well as self-censorship amongst activists on campus. And so I think the resultant sort of conflict that often pits students versus faculty, or students versus staff, or faculty versus staff, has led to a situation in which academics often feel we have to choose between institutional rewards and recognition. This goes to Tiffany's point of not having an administrative title, and expressing political dissent against the administration, especially on risky issues. And of course, Palestine, Zionism, and Israel is one of the number one, and we have to question whether as progressive academics we can really be accountable to radical or risky social justice movements. I'm really not sure that we can do it on the academic terrain without paying some price. And so I just want to end by saying that, we face this question around accountability at a moment when others are facing questions of life and death at US borders, where families and refugees are being terrorized, on the streets where Black and brown youth are being gunned down, on the Gaza border where Israeli snipers are shooting protesters one by one like sitting ducks as we speak, and right here where some of our students, some of my students have received death threats, have been blacklisted, have been threatened with threats to their admission in grad school, or employment, who are held up at borders, who are deported and incarcerated when they want to visit their families. So how can we be accountable to these lives? Thank you.